This is American Government, Monday, October 12th, 2020. We'll be finishing with the Electoral College today, looking at the criticisms of and controversies regarding the present Electoral College. On Wednesday, we began with the original intentions and nature of the Electoral College as a deliberative body to elect the president informed by popular uh, uh, input. And how on Friday, because of the rise of parties and other developments, the nature of the Electoral College system changed. So today, we'll be considering the question of whether or not to maintain, reform, or abolish the Electoral College. There are now 27 amendments to the Constitution. My guess is, if there's to be a 28th, it will probably be regarding this question, because the Electoral College has, in some ways, always been controversial, but has become more so since the last election for reasons that we'll explain. On Wednesday is the second midterm, which will cover the material on Congress and the Electoral College. We'll begin with our consideration on Friday of the party system and continue with the presidency and the judiciary to finish out the course. So, what are the contemporary criticisms of the Electoral College? The article by Martin Diamond, that's the basis of today's lecture, begins with the American Bar Association, which is the professional association for the legal profession, and its criticisms of the Electoral College and its advocacy of the national direct vote alternative with a 40% runoff plan. Interesting enough, in 1967 under Birchby and under 1977 under the same senator, the Senate Subcommittee on Constitutional Amendments entertained hearings on both in 67 and 77, chaired by Senator Birchby from Indiana, on the abolition of the Electoral College. My professor, Martin Diamond, whom I had at Northern Illinois University when I was both an undergraduate and a graduate from 1970 to 1977, I got my master's and bachelor's degree at Northern Illinois University. I spoke on this subject frequently, and the article in the Nichols Reader is actually based on his testimony before the Senate Subcommittee in 1977, at which, by the way, Diamond died of a massive heart attack. It was kind of dramatic that this individual gave his life for the defense and preservation of the Electoral College. Diamond was a hilarious, witty, and brilliant professor. And it's interesting when you look at the transcripts for the hearing. Oftentimes, and by the way, let me just say I've attended congressional hearings before, and I'm not sure how they're doing them today, but before, at least in the 70s and 80s, when I attended several of them, the stenographer would sit with a mask over his or her face, and they would repeat what was being said word for word, and typically through stenotype, they would preserve an exact record of the proceedings. And several times the transcript is interrupted by parentheses, laughter parentheses. For example, at one point when Senator Bai, who was chairing the hearing at the dais, said, "Professor Diamond, in the election of 1876, if 10,000 votes had switched from Kentucky to Ohio, there would have been a different president." And Diamond, of Jewish background, New York Jewish background, simply shot back, "Senator, as my grandfather often said, if your grandmother had wheels, she'd be a trolley." Not every student gets that joke, but the hearing room exploded in laughter. After Diamond finished his presentation, Senator Bai said, "Thank you, Professor," and Diamond said, "Thank you, Senator," and then keeled over and died instantly of a massive heart attack. Bai jumped over the dais and tried to resuscitate him with artificial resuscitation, but it did not work. So there's a little bit of drama that surrounds this argument and this author. So Diamond begins his essay quoting from the American Bar Association's criticism of the Electoral College. And what is that criticism? It's severalfold. I think some of these are more important and relevant than others, and we'll walk through them. The American Bar Association says that the Electoral College is archaic, complex, undemocratic, dangerous, and ambiguous. I think some of these don't make much sense or are incoherent or hard to understand, and you're going to see that probably the most important of all of these is the charge of undemocratic. I'm going to rearrange the order and come back to that one last. Archaic. Archaic means old, old-fashioned, no longer in use. It's true, by the way, that the Electoral College is part of the original Constitution. It's true that it no longer works the way it was intended. That's true. But so what? The Constitution is archaic. Parts of it don't work the way it was intended. History has changed much of its elements in operation. That doesn't mean that the Constitution is outdated. Just because something is old doesn't mean it's outdated. I'm 68 years old. Am I outdated? Don't answer that. Anyway, so I'm not sure that's a critical criticism. Diamond defends the Electoral College, but he doesn't defend it on the basis of the way it was intended to work, or should have worked, or did work. He defends it on the basis of the way that it does work, and argues that it does, in fact, contribute something to the American political order and to the presidential election. Second charge, complex. Complex means complicated. The suggestion here is this is a procedure of election that's hard to understand. And I must say, after teaching American government for well now on 40 years and teaching that was my Siri. God knows what she's talking to herself over there. Um, um, it's true that after teaching the Electoral College for 40 years, that I have found that students find it complicated, and it is hard to explain. Nevertheless, it can be explained. I think I've explained it um, in the last lecture, in the previous lecture, and then, as you'll see, Diamond, in defending it, explains the way that it operates. So, like many complicated things, you can understand it if you pay attention to it. Dangerous. What does this charge mean that it's dangerous? I think the authors mean that it's destabilizing, that in close elections, the Electoral College may backfire. I'm not sure I really understand or agree with this criticism. First of all, let's be clear that in any system of election, it turns out there are dangers. What we've learned, by the way, since the rise of the internet and the widespread use of computers, which were originally thought to make voting easier and less problematic, it turns out none of that's true. Hackers, complicated computer voting systems, and the same with mail-in systems. Every system of election presents dangers and problems. I suppose that you could say part of what we learn from the experience is how to counter the dangers. But I'd also say, by the way, that any electoral system, when it becomes very close, becomes problematic. And so, in some ways, the idea that it's dangerous or destabilizing, I'm not sure I see that, since the Constitution, both with the original Constitution in Article 2, Section 1, the 12th Amendment, 20th Amendment, 22nd Amendment, all the amendments that have affected the electoral procedures in the Constitution, and especially the presidential election, which, as we've seen last Wednesday and Friday in the last two lectures, that the framers gave, in fact, unusual attention to avoid certain problems, such as domination of one branch by another, hence no legislative election, as we saw on Wednesday at the Constitutional Convention, and the problems of a simple popular election, which we'll come back to, since that is, in fact, the primary alternative to the existing system that is proposed. Ambiguous, tending to produce unclear results. I'm not sure what this means either, since actually the Electoral College, as Diamond will point out, has a tendency to magnify the electoral victory from the popular vote, which tends to be very close often and certainly typically nationwide, less than a majority. So when you look historically at the popular margins that have separated candidates, the Electoral College, because of the winner-take-all system, as we'll see, has a tendency to magnify electoral uh, um, margins. And the procedures, in case one set of procedures don't work or don't produce a clear result, are the substitute procedures are intended to produce a clear result when the prior ones don't. Hence, the contingency election by the House of the presidency would produce a result if the Electoral College didn't produce a result. So, again, these charges that it's archaic, complex, dangerous, and ambiguous, I'm not sure that they're persuasive charges, because when you examine them, those charges are probably open to most electoral systems under certain circumstances, except for the complex, which I do agree. The present system is more complex than certain alternative possible systems. Of all these adjectives, archaic, old-fashioned, archaic, complex, undemocratic, dangerous, ambiguous, I believe the charge that probably is most valent in people's minds is the undemocratic charge. And on the notes, I meant to put both considerations of what people mean by this, and I forgot and put only one. I'll revise the notes and send them out again. By undemocratic, which is again probably the main and the most salient charge for people who oppose the system, mean two things. One, that the person who wins the national popular vote could lose the Electoral College vote. Now, it's important to note, we speak of the national popular vote. You have to remember and pay very close attention to this. Strictly speaking, constitutionally, there is no such thing as a national popular vote. What there is constitutionally, according to Article 1, Section 1, and the way that the system evolved and works today, constitutionally, there is state popular vote. The Constitution leaves to each state the manner in which it chooses its electors. As we saw on the previous and the previous lecture, states generally chose popular means of selecting electors. That means that constitutionally, the only popular vote, and this will be key to Diamond's defense of the system, the only popular vote that matters is the vote that actually is relevant to the selection of electors. There is, therefore, a popular vote in the Constitution, but it occurs on the state level. Now, it's true that ever since, because of modern media and going back to newspapers actually, but also radio and television and etc., we have had a tendency to amalgamate and add up the popular vote in all the states so as to create statistically a national popular vote. And in historical literature and journalistic literature, we often discuss that. But it is important to remember that the national popular vote in a presidential election is notional. That is to say, it exists in the sense that you can add up the state popular votes and can produce this statistic, this figure. But that's not what determines the presidential election. What determines the presidential election is a majority of the electoral votes in the Electoral College, the majority cast, by the way. So, is it true that the person who wins a total of all the state popular votes could lose the Electoral College vote, or if the person who wins the total of national popular votes could lose the Electoral College vote, or who wins the popular vote? Yes, that is true. That can happen. It has happened 6 times in our nation's history. What are those 6 times? In 2016, the last presidential election, Hillary Clinton won totally about 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. Yet Donald Trump, I think the tally was 306 to 149. In 2000, Al Gore won about 500,000 more popular votes nationwide than George Bush did. In 1960, and this is somewhat controversial and somewhat um, problematic because of the way the results of that election are reported and even reported in the National Archives. It is reported that President Kennedy had a slim popular majority, or a popular plurality, I should say, of about 130,000 votes over Richard Nixon. In reality, Richard Nixon got more popular votes than John F. Kennedy. How did that happen? Because in 1960, in the southern states, uh, John F. Kennedy was remarkably unpopular, and several southern states had presidential elections for electors who were pledged to other candidates in the South. So technically, what the National Archives did was to add up the popular vote for other Democratic electors than for President Kennedy, and added the popular vote for those electors to Kennedy's popular vote. In that sense, it gave Kennedy a slim plurality, as I mentioned, but in reality, Richard Nixon got roughly about 110,000 more popular votes than John F. Kennedy. It happened in 1888 in Benjamin Harrison versus Grover Cleveland. It happened in 1876 with Hayes versus Tilden. And in 1824, it happened with John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson. Now, the problem with the 1824 vote is, as I mentioned, on Wednesday, previous to the previous lecture, in the original intention of the Electoral College, originally the Constitution led to each state to choose its electors the way that it decided. And as of the election of 1824, 6 states were still not using the popular vote as a means of selecting electors. They were selecting their electors by state legislative election. So there was no popular vote in 6 states. Nevertheless, has it occurred that the person who won the amalgamated total of popular votes nationwide lost the electoral vote? Yes, those 6 times. So many people argue that the only thing that should count in the presidential election is the amalgamated popular vote, hence the alternative, as we'll see. But on the other hand, as Diamond points out, it's true that even though this has happened 6 times, the country declared the electoral winner, that person became president, and the nation went on. So it's not clear that if that happens, that the country ends. The Constitution has clear procedures that determine the presidential election, no matter who wins the national popular vote. The other charge regarding undemocratic, and again, I forgot to put this in notes, I'll revise this, but here's the second undemocratic aspect, and that has to do with the fact that each state receives the total number of electoral college votes equal to its representation in Congress, in the House, plus its representation in the Senate. Now, we know that each state gets 2 senators. Each state is equally represented in the Senate. This is the Great Compromise that goes back to July 16th, 1787, when the small states and the large states compromised. And what that means is, in the Congress, the United States of America and the American people in the United States are represented in 2 ways. They are represented directly by popular vote, and proportionately in the House of Representatives, where the more populous states have more representation, hence the census, as we've seen. But then also each state has equal representation in the Senate, where the states are represented not as people, but as states in a somewhat federal union. So in some ways, what the Electoral College does by adding 2 Electoral College votes to each state, it somewhat weights the individual votes of voters in small states. Let's take, for example, California, which has about 35 million people, has 53 representatives, and has 55 Electoral College votes. Now, that means California is a big state, the most populous state, and has the most Electoral College votes. So in that sense, it represents population, the American people, directly. Wyoming, on the other hand, only has about 400,000 people, even though it's a huge state geographically. Yet Wyoming gets 3 Electoral College votes. Now, even though Wyoming is a small state in terms of population, and therefore has relatively less weight in the Electoral College, 3 for Wyoming versus 55 for California, nevertheless, each voter in Wyoming has slightly more effect on the presidential outcome because the 3 to 400,000 voters in Wyoming have more punch because they get 3 electors per those people. If you divided, in other words, 3 by 400,000 versus 55 by 35 million, each individual in Wyoming has slightly more voting power than each individual in California, even though California as a whole has much more impact on the final presidential race, given its number of electoral college votes. So some people argue that in a nationwide election, this gives voters in Wyoming a slightly more per voter weight on the presidential election than individual voters in California. So you can argue this back and forth. You could say that the advantage of having more people and more electors outweighs the original, the individual voting weight of people in Wyoming. But it is true. In the same way, by the way, in the Senate, of course, the 400,000 people in Wyoming have considerably more voting power per voter because they have 2 senators in the Senate, just like the 35 million people in California. So in the Congress, you'd have to say that the people in Wyoming have slightly more power individually than the people do in California. Again, California in the House has 53 versus Wyoming's 1 representative. But in the Senate, the 35 million people in California have 2 senators, as do the 400,000 or so people in Wyoming, as Alaska, as Hawaii, as Rhode Island, as all the small states that only have 1 representative. Nevertheless, each state has 2 senators. So in some ways, as we'll see, this is one of the defenses of the Electoral College, somewhat akin to one of Diamond's core defenses, and that is that it reflects the actual nature of the Union, which is partially national, of the American people, proportionately in the House, partially federal, representing the states in the Senate, and that the Electoral College, in fact, reflects is a national presidential election version of the kind of representation that Congress as a whole provides. So, those are the 2 arguments probably that are uppermost in people's minds when they criticize the Electoral College for being undemocratic. 1, again, to repeat, that a national popular vote winner, adding up the popular vote of all the states to create a national statistic, could lose the Electoral College, which is true and has happened, as I said, 6 times. And the second argument, undemocratic, means that in the presidential election, it gives more individual weight to certain individual voters in the small states than it does in the large states. So, what would replace the Electoral College? And here the American Bar Association is quite explicit. And in general, this is the primary default alternative. And that would be the national direct plan with 40% runoff. But first, let's examine a couple of other proposed reforms, which probably will never get anywhere because in some ways to reform the Electoral College so as to eliminate the effects of the winner-take-all system or the disproportion in individual weighted votes from state to state would probably, the energy involved in constitutional amendment would probably be more willingly expelled from a radical change, expressed in a radical change than an incremental change. Let me explore what I mean by that. People have sometimes suggested that since we still have electors, there are still people who meet in the Electoral College in their state capitals and vote. And by and large, in fact, proportionately, I guess you could say almost as a certainty, the electors follow the popular vote in their states. Nevertheless, the argument is there can be faithless electors. That too has happened, as I mentioned. I think 7 Democratic electors in 2016 did not vote for Hillary Clinton, and I think 5 Republican electors did not vote for Donald Trump. So the problem of the faithless elector is an issue. Now, there are a couple of ways to respond to this. One is that don't forget that as long as we have electors, the Constitution says in Article 2, Section 1, that the electors shall choose. That means that the people who are voted as electors, no matter what the popular vote or any other directive in their state is, technically the Constitution grants those people the right to choose the president. So, in some ways, several states have tried to limit or eliminate the discretion of electors by putting fines, by having electors take oaths that they will follow the popular vote, etc. Generally speaking, the Supreme Court and most judicial opinion in the United States is that these limitations, which have never been fully tested in court, are unconstitutional because the Constitution does give, in fact, discretion to to electors. Now, one way to keep the advantages, and this would be true of Diamond's arguments and defenses in favor of the Electoral College, would be to eliminate electors and just keep electoral votes, and in fact constitutionalize the winner-take-all system. Every one of the states in the Union use the winner-take-all system, with the exception, I believe, of Nebraska and Maine, where in Maine's 4 electoral votes are assigned both by district and then by the proportion of the statewide vote, and the same with Nebraska. So one alternative would be to keep the Electoral College system and eliminate electors and simply automatically tally the Electoral College vote of each state with the unit rule or the single member district rule, which treats each state as a unit, and that would eliminate the problem of the faithless elector. Another possibility is to have the proportional Electoral College vote, to have nationwide what a couple of states do, and that would be to assign the Electoral College vote of each state proportionately according to the popular vote of that state. And that means that if you added up the Electoral College vote without the winner-take-all system, that generally speaking, the Electoral College vote would in fact reflect the proportion of the national popular vote. Most people would say, okay, if you're going to do that, you might as well go all the way and simply eliminate the Electoral College and go to a national direct system. Several states have, and this is a current reform proposal where several states are trying to persuade their electors to vote according to the proportion of the national popular vote, or to assign to vote in their state electoral college units as the national popular vote goes. That's been circulating for the last couple of years, but probably ultimately won't decide presidential elections, because the reason that the winner-take-all system spread, as we'll see, was because the states in the federal system appreciated the advantage that the winner-take-all system gave to each state as a block, as a voting unit. And second, as we'll see, the party system, the two-party system, which is our dominant mode of party arrangement in this country, to which we'll turn later after when we begin to examine the party system. The winner-take-all system spread because, in fact, it supports the two-party system. We'll come back to that when we examine Diamond's arguments. So the real alternative to the present Electoral College system is probably abolition, is to abolish the Electoral College altogether and to replace it, as the American Bar Association proposed in 1967, as Senator Bayh did in 1977, and probably what most people who criticize the Electoral College for its undemocratic character support, and that is the national direct 40% runoff. The argument is, in this reform, the Electoral College would be abolished. State boundaries would, in fact, become irrelevant, and it would make the entire nation the relevant electoral district for the president. Now, with the 40% runoff plan, and we'll see when we come back to Diamond's criticism of this alternative and his defensive electoral college system, his argument is if you do away the electoral college system, you'll undermine and eventually destroy the two-party system in the United States. And we'll come back to this, but just to lay it out in front of you right now, his argument is that without the electoral college, the two-party system will fade, will become a multi-party or a nonpartisan system, and that means the number of presidential candidates will probably expand. The proponents of the national direct system more or less admit this, hence the 40% runoff alternative. The idea would be that in the first round of presidential elections, there probably would be many more candidates without the organizing presence of the two-party system. And as we discussed in the last lecture, our electoral custom is single-member districts, where with the relevant electoral district, whether it's a congressional district or a mayoral race or a state senator election, that there can only be one winner, and that winner is whoever wins the plurality, not a majority, but the most votes. And if you have, say, one national direct election with treating all the nation as a single voting unit, given that there probably will, therefore, be more presidential candidates, that means that the national popular vote under this system would probably be split by 5, 10, 15, perhaps 30 candidates nationwide. An example of this might be 3 states have what are called recall provisions for governors. The recall provision, like referenda provisions, was a feature of the progressive movement at the turn of the century, which tried to bypass certain aspects of constitutional processes for direct popular processes. A referendum, for instance, is a law that's voted in by popular vote. Most in our constitutional system on the federal level, there's no such thing. The Congress has all legislative powers. But in several states, like in South Carolina, for instance, you can propose legislation, put it on the popular ballot, and have laws passed by direct popular vote. Well, in the same way, several states adopted recall provisions, because remember that once a person is elected in the national constitution and in most state constitutions, the only way to get that person out of office is, by the way, not assassination, as one of my students once suggested a couple of years ago. That's not a constitutional process, but impeachment. Recall is a way of unelecting someone popularly. California, it turns out, is one of the 3 states that has a gubernatorial recall provision. And several years ago, its governor, Elaine Gray, was so unpopular. The way the California provision works is if 3% of the registered voters from the last gubernatorial election sign a petition to unelect the governor, then a proposal is laid in front of all the voters of the state to unelect the existing governor and replace the governor with a new appointee. The way California does this is the same motion to unelect the sitting governor is the same process to elect a new governor. And as a result, originally, before it became standard and official, there were over 244 candidates to replace Gray with another governor. By the time the ballot was produced, the number had shrunk to 144 candidates, including, by the way, California's most popular porn star. So all kinds of people got on that ballot, 144 of them, among whom was Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor. So if you think about it, if you have 100% of the vote split by 144 candidates, the likelihood that any one of them is going to get a majority or even a very significant plurality is very low. So the people who advocate the national direct vote more or less admit this by including the 40% runoff provision. On the grounds, I think reasonable, that for somebody to be president of the United States, he or she should probably have more than 40% of the vote. So, and most presidents in U.S. history have been plurality presidents with 40 to 50% of the vote. Lincoln, by the way, was a plurality president because there was a four-way race that year with uh, um, Abraham Lincoln as the Republican candidate in 1860, Stephen Douglas as the Democratic candidate. Remember, the two contestants from the Illinois senatorial race in 1858 ran for president in 1860. Plus, there was a Constitutional Union president, and there was a fourth party, um, uh, the I think the Southern Democratic Party. So there were actually four, on most states, four candidates for president. Lincoln was, in fact, a minority president of only 30, I think, 38, 39% of the vote, popular vote. Nevertheless, he won the Electoral College vote because, for reasons we'll see. So, um, uh, if so, the real alternative to the Electoral College would be to eliminate the states, eliminate the Electoral College, replace it with a single national popular vote with a 40% runoff. So really what this alternative is probably a two-stage presidential election, where the first round would contain any number of candidates, and then a runoff election, as some countries do this, by the way. I think Brazil does it this way, in a second stage where the top two or three candidates would run, and whoever got 40% of the vote would become president. So it seems to me, by the way, as long as we're considering arguments for and against, I think the strongest argument for this alternative is that it would be something like the following. The president is the president of the entire people, therefore the relevant electoral district of the presidency should be the entire nation. That's a strong argument, but even a strong argument may not be persuasive if you think that even if you agree with the premise of the argument, it may not lead to either better presidents or a better presidential system or a better political system. As you're going to see, that's something akin to Diamond's defense of the existing system. So, at any rate, the idea is at least this alternative would be somewhat simpler to explain. All the American people, no matter where you live in what state, would be voting, and each person's vote would count equally for the presidency, given that it's the president of the entire nation. That's not a bad argument, and you may be persuaded by it. So what's the defense and explanation of the existing system? Diamond argues, in response especially to the undemocratic charge, that the Electoral College in the presidential election is already as democratic as it can be. That is to say, what Diamond means is it truly is the popular vote that chooses the president, since electors vote automatically according to the popular vote in their states. So, his argument is, and he repeats this phrase several times, the Electoral College and the presidential election is democratic in the states, and he's quite right about this. To win the presidency, you must get at least a plurality of popular vote in the states. So what the Electoral College does, in effect, and this is, I think, a true grasp of its nature, not just Diamond's defense, I think it is true. The Electoral College takes the single presidential election and divides it up into 51 local state elections, where candidates to win the presidency have to go to each state and persuade the people of that state to support them. That's, in essence, what we're seeing and have seen unfolded in the last 150 years since this system evolved in the 1820s. That's what Donald Trump and Joe Biden are doing, and that's what every presidential candidate would do under the present system. So, Diamond is correct in the sense that even though we have electors, and even though there might be the potential for faithless electors, very minute, the electors do vote according to popular vote in their states. So, that's what. So to win the presidency, Diamond argues, you have to go state to state. You have to actually speak to the local issues. You have to persuade not only the voters in each state, but the supporters of the major parties and local organizations in those states. And therefore, to win the national election in the Electoral College, you have to get a series of local popular majorities or pluralities in the states. So it is fair to say that Diamond is correct. The present system is a popular system, but it federalizes the election by having the relevant electoral district of the presidential election be the states. So, what's Diamond's defense of this system? His argument is that if we abolish the Electoral College, of course, it will probably undermine, if not destroy, the two-party system. We'll come back to this and explain this more fully in a second. And that means that there probably will be more candidates. Without the two parties organizing the election, that means that people like Michael Bloomberg, the billionaire former mayor of New York, or Tom Steyer, the individual from California, the billionaire, who funded his own campaign. Without the organizing, nominating structures of the two parties or party system, that means that probably there would either be many more candidates who fund their own campaigns. And for instance, in the 2016 election, where there were 19, I have to stop my Alexa just a second. Alexa, stop.
10 a.m. alarm stopped on Jeffrey's Echo Dot.
Now you know what Alexa sounds like if you didn't know before. So at any rate, Diamond is probably right that without, and we'll see when we turn to the party system, American voters vote according to three different influences. Even though the influence of parties, as we'll see in the next couple of lectures, has declined as an organizing factor for American voters, nevertheless, most of Americans still vote primarily by party label. Party labeling is a kind of a cue or a simplification of voter choice, and that's how most voters still vote, although it has been declining. The other two possibilities that might determine a voter's vote are the candidate's identity or personality. You vote for the individual, not the party, or an issue. Many voters, as we'll see, are single voter issues or multiple voter issues, but most people have several different issues that are important to them politically, but some people are single issues like abortion or the environment or climate change or something like that. So if you don't have party labels organizing voters' choice, then you have to fall back on either candidate name recognition or issue. So Diamond is probably correct that if the two parties, in fact, decline in our system, the number of presidential candidates on the national level will expand. They will divide the vote. There will be runoffs, and there will be a certain loss of vitality in local and state party organization and participation. So, according to Diamond, the Electoral College is good and worth preserving because, one, it preserves the weight and importance of the states in the federal system. As I mentioned earlier, his argument is what the Electoral College does for the presidential election is what the Congress does for the mixed nature of the American Union. It is essentially the American people together, we the people of the United States, as we discussed when we looked at the preamble of the Constitution and the nature of the Union under the Constitution. But nevertheless, there is an element of the old federalism or confederalism in the Constitution, in that in the House, the American people are represented directly and proportionately, and in the Senate, the states are represented equally as states. So in some ways, Diamond's argument is, since the power of the national government has expanded, and generally speaking, the national government has concentrated more and more power in its hands, somewhat mitigating the diffusion of power that the federal system normally encourages in our system of government, that to eliminate the Electoral College would be to nationalize and homogenize our politics even more, and that the states would lose a vital element in the federal system in terms of organizing the presidential election and political life within their boundaries. That's probably true. So if somebody says to you, we should preserve the Electoral College because it helps to preserve the importance of the states in the federal system and the weights of the states as political units, then you could agree or disagree with that. Of course, what you'd have to agree or disagree with is, why are the states important in the system? Now, we've already raised that question, and either you can be persuaded by that argument if you think the states are vital elements of the system and should be preserved, or if you would favor more of a nationalizing or a centralizing aspect of political power. So again, on the first main argument that Diamond makes, that the Electoral College preserves the states, whether or not you're persuaded by that argument depends upon how much you value the presence and vitality of the states in our political system. It's a federalism question. Now, The second major argument that he gives is that if you abolish the Electoral College, it will undermine and perhaps destroy the two-party system. He may be right about that, but let's understand why that would be the case. The Electoral College supports the two-party system because it discourages third-party voting. For instance, in the 2016 election, there was also a Libertarian candidate and the Reform Party candidate. I think the Libertarian candidate got nationwide a 4% of the vote, I think, popular vote, and Jill Stein, the Reform Party candidate, got, I think, 1% nationwide. But neither of those candidates got any Electoral College votes. Why? Because the winner-take-all system requires you to win a plurality of votes on the state level. And that's, you get all of that state's Electoral College votes. Hence, voters in the states have a tendency to think economically, and rather than throw their weight in the Electoral College away by voting for a minor party, most voters tend to support one of the two major parties because those are the only ones who have a chance of obtaining the state's Electoral College vote. So it's probably true that if you abolish the Electoral College, you will encourage many more political parties to form because they would have weight in the final election. So again, remember the Electoral College does in fact discourage third-party voting. So it's probably true that if you abolish the Electoral College, the two-party system will weaken and perhaps disappear as an organizing influence. Now, for you to be persuaded by that argument, you have to be persuaded that the two-party system is a good thing. And some people criticize the two-party system and advocate we should get rid of that and replace that with something else either. That question we'll turn to next week. So, it's true, Diamond's arguments rest upon you accepting two other prior arguments. One, that the states and the federal system are a good thing and their influence and vitality should be preserved. And the second, that the two-party system is an overall benefit to the American party system, and that to abolish the Electoral College would probably diffuse, dissolve, and undermine that system. And whether that's a good or bad argument, you'll have to wait until next week to figure that out. So let's conclude our consideration of this question by asking, would a national direct system lead to better candidates? I want to end, in other words, with the better president, mediocre president. Bryce's argument that we saw on Friday, that because we have a party in popular election, that great men are not elected president. Would, in other words, a national direct system lead to a system where we produced better presidents? Would it lead to a better political system? Those are larger questions, and to some degree, I think you'd have to say that if we did, in fact, abolish the Electoral College and substitute for the state-by-state popular election that we now have for a national popular election, which would probably be even more media-oriented, even more television-oriented, even more social media-oriented, would, in fact, the quality and tone of our elections, our presidential election, improve? Would, in fact, we get better candidates than we do at this point in time? Would our political system be better off without the stabilizing and moderating influence of the two parties, polarized as we are now? I think those are good questions worth thinking about, and I think the answer to those questions is probably speculative. So that's how we'll end this class on abolishing, reforming, or preserving the Electoral College system. And I think to some degree, the question in most people's minds is, would it be more democratic? It might be more democratic in the sense that it would be more national. Would that lead to better candidates for the presidency? Would it lead to better presidential campaigns? And would it lead to a better political system? That, I think, you have to decide for yourself.